So this is our session on global desis, and we have three kinds of global desis who have interpreted both globalness and desidom in various different ways. Padma Lakshmi, who was born in India and raised in the US, and a global citizen of sorts. Jonathan Gill Harris, whose book, The First Firangis, is an account of people who have come from various parts to India through history, and whose journey he too has mirrored in many ways. Alex Travelli, who has lived and worked in various cultures and is now desi by marriage. To begin with, let me start with you, Padma. In your book, you write about the stories that your grandfather tells you about the cuckoo. And very much like that, you too have sort of flown into various nests and made your home there. But as someone who was taken to a foreign culture as a young kid, what were the anchors, and who has retained quite a bit of your Indianness, what were the anchors to your culture that you sort of held on to while you were growing up in the US?
I think one of the big anchors for me was my grandfather and in large part my family. I was lucky enough, even though I grew up mostly in the States, to spend 3 out of 12 months every year from the ages of 5 to 17. I don't think that I had much difficulty hanging on to my heritage or feeling like an Indian, regardless of where I lived. I also spent most of my 20s in Europe, in France, and in Italy specifically. And there is a difference in living in Europe to living in the United States. When I lived and worked in Europe, I would say that I had to dilute my own ethnicity less than I did when I worked in America, in the same professions. And so, I was sitting around thinking about this obviously a lot when I was writing the memoir. And I think I didn't need so much of an anchor because I had it in my family and I felt it very much deeply. What I needed was to not take the need to assimilate for professional reasons personally. And it's hard not to take those things personally. And when I was writing the memoir, I had no way of knowing how relevant the themes in my book, that is, being a professional woman in America and certainly being an immigrant in America would have in this current climate. It's, become the most important topic in American culture.
Alex, even though you came to India to work, that wasn't your first sort of introduction to desis. I was quite surprised to find out that you went to a school in America which had predominantly a large number of desis. Do you want to tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I don't know, Veena, whether to claim it as a coincidence or not. Some of my friends and family have looked for explanations as to why I've kept coming back to India over the past 20 years. I just moved here permanently a few years ago. But if you wanted to get psychological about it, you'd look to my upbringing in this, in most ways, ordinary suburb in western Chicagoland, where it wasn't predominantly Indian, but there was an enormous number of, and these are mostly the South Indian professional families, mostly the families of engineers and physicians who moved in the late 60s. Yeah, I was about to say, I feel like we kind of grew up in the same place, though in different cities. There were, of course, very different things about the kids from Indian extractions. The rest of us noticed how much more easily they actually did pick up Americanization of various kinds. I was often taking cues from classmates who were ostensibly more foreign than I was. And much more so than the East Asian immigrants. The children of East Asian immigrants tended to be marked out as immigrants in a way much more.
Do you think that's because in India, Indians have been doing this all over their country because we speak so many languages and have very distinct cultures even within the nation? So in a way, we're pre-practiced in doing this.
I do think so, actually. There's a flexibility that's natural, and what goes with it, maybe perversely, is there's also a stickiness about Indian culture, even while these kids I was growing up among adapted so well. It was striking from the point of view of European-descended Americans, many of whom I'm sure went on to vote for Trump in a recent election, that the Indian kids may have spoken with an American accent, the East Asian kids typically wouldn't, and many other things that go with that, but their names stayed the same. They'd be named Padma, not Penny or Pamela like the East Asian kids would.
Well, I am guilty of changing my name for a period of time in high school. It's a cringeworthy story, but which I won't go into
What
now.
was your name?
Oh, God. It was Angelique.
Huh.
She's an odd name, I know.
No, but was that
But
inspired by
it's also both
Anjali?
Indian and it's also both Indian and Western in that sense.
It's like Anjali, that's
yeah.
right. I don't think that was anything to do with why I did that. My mother had a friend who I admired greatly, and that was her name. And I think it was because I wanted to appear less foreign. You know, my name, I could always tell when the teacher was coming to my name in the attendance roll call, because I always thought my name was spelt incredibly phonetically, but, you know, you could see the hesitation, and I would say, I know who you want me.
I don't know if the harder journey is for an Indian to go abroad or for a foreigner to come to India. But Jonathan Gill Harris, you write a lot in your book about the journeys that Firangis have made towards India. And I was particularly sort of curious about what you talk about the bodily transformation of the Firangi in India. Would you describe how the transformation sort of progresses?
So I think we tend to think of migration as largely a matter of getting a passport, moving, and the difficulties of migration are largely confined to adapting culturally. But migration is also at root an embodied experience. We've been so trained to think of our bodies as self-contained units that are the same wherever they go. But bodies are, of course, nodes within environments, ecologies that are constantly transforming.
And what about your own transformative experience when you came to India?
So, I mean, there are all sorts of experiences that I could tell you about, some of which are perhaps a little bit too scatological to talk about here. But I think the experience that has been most noticeable is immersing myself in a different linguistic ecology. And that may seem like a very academic way of talking about an experience that is sort of deeply visceral. I'd grown up in, at least outside my house, an absolutely Anglophone environment. At home it was different because I was the children of immigrants, so there was Polish and Hebrew spoken at home. But as soon as I set foot outside, I heard only English. Now, once I started visiting India, I learned Hindi, or I learned something that my teacher called Hindi in Washington, D.C. It was a language that no one has ever spoken. It was so heavily Sanskritized that it even made Doordarshan seem like some sort of Chandni Chowk dialect. But I felt very pleased with the progress I'd made in this particular form of Hindi.
So at what point do you sort of realize that, oh, now I'm integrated into this new world that I had been brought into? And what are the sort of transformative changes that have to happen to lead up to that point?
I think the difference between conformity and integration is success. I think when you are in a weak position and trying to aspire to break into a group and distinguish yourself in that group, then you do all sorts of things to conform. I mean, you know, when I first started modeling, this had nothing to do with my ethnicity, but when I first started modeling, I became very good at covering my scar on my arm with makeup. And then once I became well known, I no longer had to cover the scar on my arm because, you know, people knew that that's what I had. And in fact, under all that makeup and clothing on the runway, they wanted to make sure that people knew I was walking. So I think that is the difference. When you have elbowed or created a space for yourself. And in my case, through my writing, and yes, largely through my writing, I was able to finally come to a place where I found success being exactly who I actually am. I host a food show, and I'm playing a role on television which has nothing to do with my ethnicity. And I think for me, that is when I truly integrated, because my heritage and my nationality, whether I'm an American citizen or Indian born, had nothing to do with the job and why I was qualified with it, to do it. And so that to me was the point at which I felt integrated, when I had distinguished myself for my work, my knowledge and my merits, rather than where I was from, or being a symbol of this exotic person. And I think there was just an article in New York Magazine by where they list 20 prominent women that are interviewed, and they say, stop looking at us as exotic and something other or foreign, because we are actually the American experience, and we are actually the face of what it is like to be American.
Gill, in your research for the book, one of the threads that sort of comes across is how the Firangi changes the culture of India, and at the same time, India changes the culture of the Firangi, and especially the doctor who comes and learns homeopathy. And so to sort of draw threads from the book to highlight, the benefits of this sort of intermingling of cultures.
I think my favorite Hindi word that I've acquired over the years is jugaad. I think there's an improvisational quality that distinguishes cultures all across the subcontinent, but also characterizes the experiences of migrants who have to perform jugaad in order to adapt, in order to cope with radically new terrains in which they find themselves.
Padma, you're now raising a child.
What? Yes, I'm now raising a child.
So, are you conscious about sort of instilling desihood in her, or do you expect that it will just happen?
No, nothing just happens the way you want it. But no, I mean, I think about it a lot, actually, as a mother and as an Indian mother. I think about it every day. My child is biracial, and she lives in New York and is raised, by an American father and somebody who is Indian but very Americanized as her mother. And I'm lucky in that, being Indian now in American culture is quite trendy. But Krishna is, now going through a period where she calls herself goth and punk. She's going to be 7, by the way. But, but for most of her life, she has loved all of the things that she can comprehend about being Indian. That is wearing a big sparkly bindi, wearing bangles, getting dressed up in a lehenga. We go to the same temple that I visited when I was 6 years old. That, they consecrated that temple in Queens in 1976. So we don't go often, but we probably go, I would say, half a dozen times a year. But there are other times, like the New Year or Pongal, where if we can't go to the temple, we light the lamp, and we've recently got camphor, which she's very excited about lighting all the time, so it makes her slightly more pious. So I don't have trouble. The only place I really struggle, and, I'm trying to crack that nut, is she understands Tamil, but she will not answer me in Tamil, unless she wants to butter me up, which is very easy and only takes 2 or 3 words, and, to do like, ayo, please, amma, and sort of like, but she also, I just decide that we are going to be an Indian household, and that's not something that's an effort for me. Sunday is khichdi night, and she'll often say, can we just have something that's not Indian, please? And I'll say, no, this is an Indian Indian kitchen, and this is an Indian household. So, and often, much to her dismay, her father will crave a dosa, and they'll have to go out to eat when she's with him too. So, I think this is an issue that will be rearing its head in different forms as she gets older.
Alex, you too are in a similar situation, raising a half desi, half Firangi child in India. What are your experiences in sort of keeping the two cultures together in such a little person?
Oh, it's early days. He's a very little person. He had 4 kilos yesterday. We had what is he? He's like 2 months old baby, and a paradox I've noticed is that in a way, despite the political headwinds, and I congratulate us for not dwelling on them too much, despite the volcanic rise of ethno-nationalism or recurrence of ethno-nationalism in the West, you could also find it easily enough in Indian politics these days if you wanted. Despite all of that, it's become almost comically easy to make binational, even biracial children. As in Delhi, as in New York, you start talking, even when the child is not yet born, about what schools to send them to. Yeah. Your friends who are already parents have their worries and concerns. We were just taking advice from a couple that's both ethnically Indian, have 1 or 2 extra nationalities to their names, and they were telling us, they'll go unnamed, yes, those schools you're talking about, this board or that board, good Delhi schools for Indians, might be fine, but are you sure you don't want to put them in one of these 2 international schools instead? I said, yeah, we're pretty sure. We want him not to grow up with transients for friends because he's not going to be a transient. And they said, yeah, but, the air isn't fully purified in any school but the one that we've chosen, which brings such new meaning to the concept of a bubble. I couldn't have asked for a more literal way of putting it. Anyway, I hope his lungs turn out fine, but we're quite sure that we want him to grow up in a place where he, whatever privileges he does have, can feel like he really belongs there and isn't, like the child of expats in Hong Kong.
Indian culture is so rich and so deep and vast that surely for every child, if you want to, you can find many things to entice their interest with.
A question that sort of rings right through it is not necessarily about a Firangi becoming an Indian, but what kind of an Indian does the Firangi become?
Indian is a deceptive noun because it doesn't have a single referent. And I think that is something very important for us to remember in the present, where there is an increasing drive to homogenize and singularize India in terms of the way that we speak about those who are not Indian. And our experience of globalization is very different, say, from that of a Rohingya Muslim coming from Burma, finding herself in Jammu, at the receiving end of a great deal of hostility.
What does being a global desi or a global person mean in the next 15 years? Whoever feels like taking the question.
I don't know if this is germane to your question, but I think I'm a hyper-Indian nationalist in my household. That whatever happens outside, that we make sure we supplement it. Probably I'm more Indian now that I'm a mother than I was at any other time in my life. The greatest benefit that I see to Krishna is that regardless of where she lives, and she may live in an environment that is hyper-national and exclusionary, that she's able to navigate that while not losing her own sense of self, whatever that means to her, that she's able to have this duality of being, which is something that I've managed to have.
All right, thank you very much, Padma, Gill, Alex, and thank you all. You were a lovely audience.
Thank you.